I want to, in this brief podcast, I hope to keep it brief, I want to concentrate on uh, Dr. Shashi Tharoor's mendacity. He tells lies. And the interesting thing about his mendacity is that very often he doesn't seem to understand that he's telling lies. And yet, he has the same information set as I do. His background is not very different from mine. He was born in this country, in Britain. His father held very similar sorts of jobs to the sorts of jobs that my father had. We're both South Indian. There's very little cultural difference between us. It is true that he's very much more handsome and has a honeyed voice. But the other thing is that, of course, he has a tremendous academic record. I think he got a PhD from Georgetown very young, while I'm the idiot of my family and as stupid as shit. But Tharoor tells stupid lies, and he tells stupid lies about the British in a manner which is very harmful to India, because young people, they're going to admire Shashi Tharoor, they're going to listen to what he has to say. And they're right to listen to him for one reason, that is that he has a superb style of speaking. And you could fare much further, and you'd fare much worse if you sought a model to emulate in terms of elocution, in terms of cogency. But there is, as I said, there is a great danger in listening to Tharoor uncritically. Now, I'm going to play a little section of an interview or some sort of and this is Shashi Tharoor on what the British did to India and the Antidote Festival at Sydney Opera House.
You went to high school in an education system that was set up by the British. You were educated in English. You're a man who rose to be UN Under Secretary General. I mean, these are advantages that might not have been, or almost certainly wouldn't have been possible without the British Empire. Are you ignoring that?
So this stupid Australian is saying that if Britain hadn't ruled India, then India would not have had people who spoke excellent English, who could be Secretary General of the UN or anything else. And of course this is quite false. China wasn't ruled by the British, but by the 1930s it had people who they'd spent their own money to go to America to study, and they spoke perfect English, and they were actually excellent writers in English. Take Lin Yu Tang, his books, which I read, and people like Tharoor, if he was anything like me, he'd have read, and this was our introduction to Chinese literature and Chinese philosophy. So China had wonderful English-speaking people. It had mission schools. Missionaries would turn up, and you could learn French in the French missionary school and German, and So the stupid Australian is basically saying, "Listen, you fucking abo, a bunch of darkies. If the British hadn't turned up and beaten you until you went to school, and you wouldn't be speaking English, and you wouldn't be a nation, and you'd be." And Tharoor is listening to the shit. And he's doing that in Australia, and he knows. Tharoor knows very well about white Australian policies. He knows that in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, a Indian diplomat who belonged to some royal family or the other, who spoke impeccable Sandhurst, clipped English, had been to the bloody public schools and all that sort of shit. This guy was thrown out of a golf club. And they said, oh, it's because he's wearing this type of jacket and not that type of jacket. He went home and changed his jacket and came back and chucked out again. So you're talking about a deeply racist, but also a deeply ignorant, and which is why I like the Australians, because their racism was bloody-minded, proletarian, and yeah, it was so déclassé. You can't take offence. There's this hooligan element. These were the Botany Bay convicts, reveling in their own swinishness. And that's why I like Australians. But of course, Italian immigrants and other immigrants to Australia, they hated it. They sound Australian, they look Australian. In other words, handsome, because Australians do look bloody fucking marvelous. They're very well educated. They've got an excellent education system. But it is the Italian who really, or the other, civilized peoples who settled in Australia, they fucking hate Aussie-ness. I don't. I like it. But Tharoor basically is being asked by probably a very well-educated guy who's playing up his Aussie backward, retarded, racist stereotype, which doesn't really exist anymore, I'm sure. But he's playing that up. And what does Tharoor say? Let us listen.
That historical reality?
It's a very good question, because in fact the educational system in India that the sort of elite subscribes to is very much indeed a legacy of the colonial era, with appropriate modifications. So we do study.
So this is bullshit. The fact of the matter is that there was no elite system for education imposed by the British. It just didn't exist. Yes, there were Maharaja schools, like Mayo College and Aitchison College, but the emphasis in those schools was on, you learned a little bit of English and you learned some, and you played cricket. Cricket was important. But the emphasis was on, you'd come there with your own tutors, you'd have your own body servants, if you're a prince. The ethos was really to inculcate, yes, a little bit of English, in the same way that the Nizam of Hyderabad, among the tutors that he employed for his, for the young aristocrats, for the heirs, and they'd have the Arabic tutor, they'd have the Persian tutor, they'd have also an English tutor, and yes, there'd be a bit of sports and that sort of thing. But the Mayo and Aitchison and the other chieftain colleges of India weren't at all similar to the British public schools, and there was absolutely no attempt to impose a British idea on Indians. It just simply isn't true. On the other hand, what you do find is that there was tremendous enthusiasm on the part of the rising middle classes in India, more particularly actually among, for example, Khatris. Khatris were enthusiastic for it. It's the Punjabi Khatris who demanded Doon School, which Doon School, you can say, is the Eton of India. It was set up by nationalists, a modern school in Delhi. They were set up by nationalists. That is the Doon School, a modern school in Delhi, and these sorts of institutions. They displaced they became the mimetic target for the traditional missionary schools. You had the missionary schools, but the realization was there. For example, the school I went to in Delhi was St. Columba's, which was set up around about the time of independence. And this was the Catholic Church saying, well, let's put in some Irish Christian brothers, because the Irish, of course, have always supported the Indian independence struggle, and Ireland was a neutral country. It was Da Valera had been very close to the Boses and the Giris and, Vithalbhai Patel, the elder brother of Sardar Patel. So that it was a smart move. But they also, they tailored the St. Columba's type ICSE type education which Tharoor received. This is something which evolves quite rapidly, and it is to fulfill the ambitions not merely of the Khatri caste North India, because the centre of gravity moved to North India. In the south, you had a different type of idea, but Tharoor really is more the St. Xavier's, Calcutta, St. Stephen's, Delhi. He's that idea. That's why he sounds odd. Whereas, of course, the traditional Christian idea, missionary schools of the south, they were not concerned with inculcating a sort of a fake Britishness or a fake British public school ethos. They were not concerned with that. While Mayo and Aitchison and so on, the old traditional public schools, chieftain schools, the aristocratic schools, they were about conserving aristocratic values, Indian aristocratic values, and which had nothing to do with learning French and poodle fakery, as the colonels of the time would say. But Doon School was. So it is Doon School which produces people like Vikram Seth, and so many others. Karan Thapar, typical Doon School. Tharoor would probably have been too poor to go to Doon School. Manishankar Iyer also was too poor, but his mum took a job teaching so that he could go to Doon School. And this fake Manishankar Iyer or Shashi Tharoor accent, it's a fake accent, and it's Tardian mimetics. It's really middle-class people belonging to, chartered accountants or lawyers, small time. They are aspiring to an imaginary British public school tradition whereby the squire, Tom Brown comes to rugby, but Tom Brown is going to inherit 10,000 acres of, Shropshire or whatever. But this was a fantasy, it was a fantasy. So really, the other point is that, of course, they're, ambitious people in India, just as in China or in Thailand or in Indonesia or anywhere else, or in Lebanon, they could send their kids to schools and to colleges where they, to come to sound like and to have a common sort of epistemic culture with other, wealthy people of a cosmopolitan type. So, that would have existed anywhere. And we can see that the Chinese have done it without ever having been colonized. I mean, I've met, initially when I met really posh Chinese people who'd been to Millfield and Eton and so on, initially they were, they came from certain comprador families, similar to Parsi families. But very interestingly, you see, the Parsi who goes to Eton and so on, he doesn't get carried away by it. He doesn't buy into that image of himself. Because the Parsi ethos, it's founded on, plain Gujarati ethics and family values and, and look at the Tatars, they keep that element to a certain extent, though of course they are hardly, they're somewhat removed from the DNA point of view from their ancestral foundations. But let us hear a little bit more from Tharoor.
The Indian history from a somewhat more nationalist perspective than I'm sure our ancestors did when the British were teaching it. But by and large, a lot of in fact, I took
So, what the fuck is this guy saying? He's saying that the British taught Indian history. This never happened. This never happened. There were British historians who wrote about India, but this was not something that Indians were required to learn so as to get a job. Indians had a choice. They could learn any bloody history that they liked, and in fact, what they did. If you look at, for example, the history that Mahatma Gandhi studied, there is no. Look at the text, and there is nothing particularly British about it. The only way in which you can, it's true that Gandhi says that, yes, well, he uses the English word. He says history. There is history, and there is itihas, which is the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. But he cannot say that there was some British history which was taught. Because that's not true. Any sort of history could be taught. There simply did not exist any type of coercive mechanism to induce an ideological conformity. What did exist was competitive exams. To get clerical sort of jobs and that sort of thing. But once again, it had no ideological component because you simply memorized nonsense and you regurgitated nonsense, and that was the end of the matter. You didn't have to believe any of that shite. Now for the ICS, but it was only the ICS. There was no other covenanted service which required you to jump through hoops. But ICS was a different matter because there the test was a political loyalty and there were other considerations, and also some people who had no British idea whatsoever, they could be appointed into that cadre. And later on, of course, the very last ICS officers in India, they were appointed on the basis that they were army officers, and it was cheaper to induct them into the ICS because they agreed to a pay cut than to leave them in the army. So all this is these are things that Tharoor knows about because he has relatives. He comes from the same fucking social background as I do, and he knows. He knows that daddy and mummy didn't talk in this absurd manner. We might do so for laughs or for shits and giggles, but it's simply not the case that there was ever any brown Englishmen. I mean, there may have been Eurasians, there may have been some people who liked being British in the same way, but others, wanted to be ancient Indian yogis, and they dressed like that, and others wanted to be Americans, and others. That was a personal choice.
Examinations that were nominally called the Indian School Certificate, but when I took them, the examination answer papers were shipped off to Cambridge, literally by ship, and we had to wait 3 months for somebody in Cambridge to correct them, grade them, and send them back. I mean, the system was very much anchored in that.
Yeah.
Though, in fact, the schools I went to happened to be...
So, basically, what Tharoor, what he's doing here is he's pretending that the schools like St. Columba's and St. Xavier's, he is pretending that they were not serving the interests of a particular upwardly mobile group, an Anglophile group. And he's sort of saying, no, it's the Indian government, or it was the British before them who did this. And whereas the truth is, it was a market-driven phenomena which arose after independence, not before. Because before independence, the British would always say, well, you can't leave school without really solid credentials, not in English. We don't give a shit about English. You must know Urdu or Punjabi or Bengali or whatever, because otherwise you're useless. You know, if all you can do is... but after independence, what happens is that the rules are changed. So that for the very first time, you have a generation of people like Midnight's Child, Salman Rushdie, like Vikram Seth, like Rajiv Gandhi. You have people who, for the very first time in history, can matriculate, they can leave school without being able to read and write a single Indian language. Rajiv Gandhi was reading out Hindi. He knew Hindi. His family spoke Hindi. He was reading it out in Roman script because he didn't know Devanagari, he didn't know Urdu, he didn't know any Indian script. And this business of shipping exam papers here and there, look, the fact of the matter is that the ICSE, it was given by a small minority of schools. It was a matter of snobbishness. We even had our schools, the year end was in December, whereas for everybody else it was in March or April or whatever it might be. It was just, this was a class marker. And the idea was that if we went to an ICSE school rather than a Kendriya Vidyalaya, a central school, or, that on the one hand, you were escaping the burden of having to learn, in my case it would have been Tamil and Sanskrit or, whatever, or Hindi, and, you're escaping that burden, and so you can concentrate on English. And by the time that Tharoor matriculated, everybody wanted to get the fuck out of India because it was a shithole. Thanks to Indira Gandhi, it was going, the Congress Party had fucked it over. It was a shithole. You just wanted to leave. And that's what Tharoor did. And, good for him. Well done. Because, frankly, he's a useless tosser. It's not as though we can say that had he remained in India, he'd have done anything very wonderful. No. Fuck him. Good riddance to bad rubbish. And of course the same applies to me. But this is really the...
Missionary schools, Jesuits who were not English. I mean, they were Belgian and French and Spanish and God knows what else, and Indian too, but not too many English Jesuits. Nonetheless, the system came from that, and I've talked...
So, obviously, the system did not come from the English, because any missionary could set up any sort of school, any Hindu guy or Muslim guy or Buddhist guy or anybody, or Americans, or you could set up any sort of school. There's absolutely no bar, or there was... Yes, if you wanted a capitation grant from the government, then you had to have a school inspector turn up to check that things were kosher and so on. But this is this is really very similar to what happens on the free market, where you have to have independent auditing and independent confirmation that credentials are up to snuff. Now, in the case of India, there was a time when people would say back in the 50s and the 60s that India is such a corrupt country that if the exam papers aren't sent to Britain, then, if somebody gets first class, it must be because his daddy is related to the minister. That sort of thing. And of course, Pakistan, which is much more corrupt than India, they still have O levels and A levels for their elites. That means they'll spend the money to get their accreditations certified in America. But in India, this is not the case, because after all, we no longer believe that nonsense. It was obvious. There are people who did extremely well in physics and in mathematics and so on. They came from the villages and they gone to the wrong sorts of schools, and they couldn't speak English, or they spoke English with the wrong sort of accent. Doesn't matter. By the 1970s, or even the late 60s, they're getting to America, and they go up, while the Tharoors of the world, they end up doing worthless shit in the United Nations, whereas other guys, they became millionaires. They invented new stuff. So the Tharoors done well, but not as well as smart people. And those smart people, it doesn't matter what sort of school they went to. Anyway, the reason that I make this point about Tharoor is that he is not just lying, and he's not just lying to foreigners. He is perpetrating a casteist myth, whereby we're supposed to believe that because the British trusted Nehru to take over, and of course Nehru described himself as the last Englishman in India. What Tharoor is really saying is that, the British came and they changed India. They imposed an idea, they imposed a system of education. And the guy who did best in that was Nehru. And that's why they gave him a shining medal. You're the last Englishman in India. And so now you'll be Prime Minister. And then your daughter should be Prime Minister. And then her son, and then his son. And Tharoor says, well, I went to this sort of school, and my exam papers were sent to England to be marked. So I am British certified. I didn't go to school at Eton. I didn't go to school at Harrow. But I did go to, a missionary school, a Catholic school. There were Jesuits. There was St. Xavier's. There were Jesuits. But you see, the Jesuits were actually, because the Catholic Church actually does the bidding of the British, because the British are the greatest. That's why I sound British. And God has sanctified my sweat equity, the sweat equity that I get through my wife, or my girlfriend, who becomes my wife and then dies. Anyway, so this is this is the crazy shit that this nutter is saying. Now, what he doesn't mention is that he went to St. Stephen's in Delhi. But what is St. Stephen's? Well, St. Stephen's is an Anglican mission, and it was of, the C.F. Andrews, the big pal of Mahatma Gandhi. And C.F. Andrews and the St. Stephen's mission has a particular importance for the Indian independence struggle, for the trajectory of the Indian national movement. But Tharoor is ignorant of that. He doesn't know about it. You see, the very first person from St. Stephen's to really have an impact on Indian politics was whom? Who was it? Well, the answer is it was a prodigy, Lala Hardayal, who, in those days, after you complete your degree at St. Stephen's, to get your MA, you'd have to go to Lahore, and that's what this young man did. And, for people like Kushwant Singh, or many years, who was 30 years younger than Hardayal, when they went to school, everybody would say, oh, if you're a good student, he's like Lala Hardayal. Look, see, he's got 100% his, So Hardayal is the first great prodigy created by St. Stephen's, in fact, and also the last. There has been no prodigy created by St. Stephen's. It's a shithole. It's nice, but it's a shithole. There are no smart, sensitive aliens. There are nutters and worthless wankers like Ayer and Zia, President Zia of Pakistan. Yes, he was a sensitive alien. And of course, Rahul did attend St. Stephen's for a bit. He got a shooting scholarship. So, and St. Stephen's completely ignored its history. Because you see, what happened with Lala Hardayal is that under the influence of a Arya Samaji missionary in London, when he got a scholarship to Oxbridge here in the UK, and under the influence of an Arya Samaji, he embraced celibacy at exactly the same time that Mahatma Gandhi, who met the same Arya Samaji missionary. So around the same time, both of these guys embraced celibacy and living very simply and so on. But he kept getting married to Swedish ladies and Swiss ladies while having a very nice wife. But it must be said, he got his wife to Oxford. Seems to have forgotten about the maybe they were celibate. She got a degree and everybody got a degree, and he got a PhD, and then he started teaching philosophy or something. And he made his peace with the British, though he'd been part of the Anglo-German, the Indo-German conspiracy. He made his peace with the British a little bit before Mahatma Gandhi's unilateral surrender. In 1922, Mahatma Gandhi basically says, India will never be ready to be free because, Hindus are different from Muslims. And they will never be the same. So we can fight for Indian independence in the same way that we fight for to be spiritually pure, but so long as the world exists, we won't be. And but Lala Hardayal, of course, was even worse than Gandhi because he went to St. Stephen's, and his philosophy is shit. Gandhi is one of the stupidest men in the world, but not as stupid as Lala Hardayal. Read his books, it is shit. And though Hardayal was probably the best, the most promising, the most, smarter chap St. Stephen's produced in the estimation of his contemporaries and of his teachers. But the sad thing about St. Stephen's is that it didn't take C.F. Andrews' central insight, which is, don't be fucking elitist cunts. Don't sit around pretending that this is, Cambridge College. Use your fucking brains and do something useful. But that's something which St. Stephen's never has done. It is a parasitic institution. It fosters complacency, and Tharoor is the epitome. He is of everything that he is meretricious. And by the way, Manish Shankar, writing about Tharoor's latest book, he says it's meretricious. So that's something that we can all agree on. Two sensitive aliens damning each other for their meretricious, worthless shite. Yeah, okay. They cancel each other out. So fuck them, fuck Tharoor, and remember that any country in the world can gain any sort of idea if there is demand for it. So the Chinese did better. The Japanese did better. Any other country which wants to go ahead can do better in European idea simply by importing it and seeing how good it is and extending it if need be. So this is it's really this is pure economics. It has nothing to do with cultural hegemony. But Tharoor can't see that. For him, there's this this sort of magical quality that the British came to India, and then they created a type of education, and then they did this, and they did that, and they anointed a successor, and then they left, and now the path to sweat equity is slavish obedience. Tharoor is a despicable man, but he is a good speaker, and in emulating those qualities that he has, which have contributed to his individual success, I hope that young people will not follow him down a road which really is repugnant for free people.